Here's the question that we want to start this kind of session with is, do you believe that the things that worked in churches for the last 100 years should still be working? If I were to go down to downtown Orlando, where with all the high rises, the big businesses, right, and things like that, and if I were to go into some of the key leaders in there and say, hey, what is the one main thing that has kept your business going over the last 10, 20, 100 years? What is that topic? I would venture to guess that that main thing would be their ability to stay relevant, to understand the trends and what's changing within their business and adapt to that. The problem with that is if I were to say that to a church, most churches, it becomes that same thing. If I were to ask you that, you'd say, well, you know, if we change every 50 years or something, our ministry and how we're reaching those people, we're doing pretty good. These business leaders would say if we aren't changing on a daily basis, we're not doing good. And so we really need to look at how we can do that. Here's a few facts that we know. The number of churchless Americans has jumped nearly a third in the last 20 years. We're seeing a rise in less and less people going to church. The younger the generation, the more post-Christian it is. You can see those pie charts continuing to grow as we move through the generations. Nearly half of all unchurched Americans see no value in personally attending church. And 1 in 6 unchurched Americans labels themselves as a born-again Christian. If all of these people, 18 million returned, it would equal an influx of 50 adults in each of the nation's churches. So we look at these things and you could say to me, well, that's a pretty bleak outset. You could look at that and say, this is not a good direction. This is a problem that we have. I might say that instead of looking at it as the glass half empty, we look at it as the glass half full. What I see here is that the fields are getting larger, right? And we just have to figure out what it is and how we can begin to minister to them in a different way. And so what we look at specifically, we're an architecture firm, right, is how can facilities help bridge this cultural gap, right? How can we begin to use our buildings as a tool instead of a liability? And we look at that in 3 different ways. One, the church building should be relevant, should be flexible, and stewardship focused. So we're going to hit each one of these areas, and then I want to go into the interior of the spaces after those as well. So we'll hit these 3, and then jump into kind of some interior spaces, what we're seeing trends-wise with that. One, they should be relevant. Now, this idea of relevance has kind of 2 sides to it. You know, one, if in case you haven't noticed and been watching the news, you know, the things that are going on in our nation's culture and worldview, the church is no longer seen as relevant. It's no longer seen as something. Instead, it's a tired, kind of old, boring church. You know, that's what a church, those connotations that are dreamed up and thought of in minds of unchurched and non-Christian. On the other side, you know, the church has an issue with relevance a lot of times, right? When we think of relevance as a church, sometimes we think this is, no longer, we don't want to be, close to what relevance is, because it would end up being twisting the gospel somehow, right? We're not exactly right on with the gospel. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're saying instead is that relevance is about finding common ground. The ultimate example of this, Jesus and Paul both were excellent examples of finding common ground. I think of Jesus most importantly, right? This is the greatest example, is that Jesus had no common ground with us, right? He was God, we were man. And he said, no, I'm going to come down. I'm going to take on human flesh. I'm going to come and live with these people. I'm going to find that common ground and save people that way. And so that's really what we're looking at. We're not looking at changing the gospel, twisting the gospel. We're looking at finding that common ground. Relevance. Timeless architecture we've found to be complex, inflexible, and ultimately irrelevant. There's a higher cost to a lot of these things. There's an intricate detail. And these really, within the relevance, we start to think about, church people that are outside the church think of this. When they think of a church building, they think of the old building. They think of a kind of tired building. They think of this kind of a building, and they're attaching that. They're attaching that thought process to those buildings, to potentially buildings that you have with these old buildings. And so we've got to avoid cultural inclusion in that. Innovation, instead, what we want to do is innovation through authenticity. We really want to start to tie things closer, to become authentic, to become real to these people that are unchurched, remaining true to the surrounding context, and balancing that innovation. While staying on the cutting edge of design, we want to balance that innovation and authenticity. One of the ways we do this is through a term that we've kind of coined, this warm industrial. This is something that basically we're taking concepts of open spaces, glass, metal, steel. We're leaving the ceiling open to above. If we see a better image here in a second, I think of a space specifically like this, that 20 years ago, if you were to walk into a space, you'd say, hey, what happened? If you went into a restaurant that had an open ceiling concept, you'd go in and you'd say, what happened? They ran out of money. They didn't finish the ceiling. What happened? There's no ceiling tiles in here. Nowadays, you walk into a space like this and you feel comfortable, right? It has some open glass. It has natural textures. It has a concrete, stained concrete, sealed concrete floor. Open ceilings, even some industrial LED type lights going through there, and you feel comfortable, you feel welcome, you feel like there's a community. This is something that the rest of the American culture identifies with in this, right? Because they're seeing something that they would see in their business. They're seeing something they'd see in their community center. They're walking through a space and feeling comfortable. It feels like the coffee shop that they go out to have coffee and community with people, right? Those are the kind of spaces we're trying to break down the barriers. We're taking away these ideas of iconic architecture, iconic church design that we think of throughout history, and saying instead, let's get a design that begins to be something that our culture understands, so that that barrier can be broken down immediately as they're walking into the building. This is a church just locally in Umatilla, First Baptist Umatilla, that was just recently built. They actually put these large high-velocity fans in there, kind of furthering that industrial concept, right? Some of you might be familiar with this church, this building. And same thing here, again, continuing to bring in some of these ideas of rock and stone, natural textures within that space. It used to be that the ceilings would be painted black and you'd get kind of an industrial feel that way. We've continued to open that concept, and some churches are even going to painting that white, kind of further opening that transparency, kind of bearing all type of thing. Here you can see who we are. This is who we are. This is what we're showing. The glass, you can see through into the building, and the structure is wide open. And then incorporating sacred elements in a relevant context. So here's the concept with that. Typically when we think of churches, if you were to close your eyes and think of a church, right, you would think of a gable building with brick on it, maybe 4 columns at the front, a nice kind of traditional looking church across the culture of America that we see. And that's really what we're talking about with iconic architecture and timeless architecture, and these issues that we're having with the culture associating connotations with that. And what we're doing instead is saying we need to break down that barrier of getting people into the building. So we've got to open that up a little bit. And what we're seeing with this culture, though, is that while they say, we don't want that, there still is a need for kind of some of these traditional elements, but done in kind of a different way. It's kind of this mashup culture that we see at the same time, right? Pallet wood, reuse of elements differently, all these kind of things that we're seeing. It's the same thing within the iconic elements of the church. You're seeing here a cross that's kind of put into a contemporary location and built maybe not center of the building, but on the corner, done with kind of some metal and a different angle. It's not the traditional kind of standard cross, but done kind of in a unique way. Pews, in 99% of churches, the pews are getting removed and replaced instead with pew chairs. This church here in Louisiana actually the unique thing about this is that they left a couple of pews. When they built the building with us, they said, well, we still have a couple of people that still want pews within the church, and so we put a couple of rows of pews. The unique thing about this church is it opened about a year and a half ago now, and nobody's sitting in the pews. So they put the pews in, and now everybody is saying, well, we want to go. They're coming back and saying, okay, we want to put the pew chairs back in that area too. We're just going to go ahead and, take those out. And so, stained glass. Additionally, a lot of older churches had stained glass. We're still doing those in some cases. We're doing it in a little more contemporary, artistic manner, putting it in a nice way in the center. That's the same church here. Baptistries are a huge thing now. It used to be baptistries would be center stage, the curtain in the middle. Then suddenly, 15, 20 years ago, the projector took over, right? And suddenly there would be a screen that would come down over the top of that. And so then the newer churches said, well, let's put the baptistries just to the side. So now we'll put a camera on them. You put them to the side. Be great. We've put the camera back onto the projector screen. It's basically like they were where they were to begin with. No big deal. And so then what we've seen in the last few years is continuing that trend to go ahead and put that baptistry out in the foyer space, out in the gathering entry space outside. This church here actually has a nice patio outdoors, and they've got a water fountain. We've begun to change and put water fountains out in those space. What's really unique about this is that you'll find families love this when they're having a baptism, right? Because they can all kind of gather around, have a really intimate setting with the baptism, but the church family can still watch, again, on the screen, center stage, right? In the middle where it used to be, same type of concept. And then the second, so that was kind of the relevance piece. The second is then the flexibility of the space, buildings that can adapt to change. And what we're really talking about this is how many ways can we continue to use a building? As we're seeing trends in giving, Eric will talk more about that in the next stage, but talking about how we're seeing downward trends in giving and these kind of things, how can we continue to use less and less space in a more efficient manner? Because the one thing we know is that churches overall are some of the worst used spaces in all of America. There's Dan Cook, who's our founder, has a famous phrase of saying that churches are the least used building type in America, second only to NFL football stadiums, right? And so how can we begin to minimize some of these spaces, but flexible use some of these spaces in a better way? And so there's a couple of ways we look at that. One, first and foremost, from the very start of the building process, we want to look at flexible planning. This starts with a master plan of your site. We'll talk more about kind of the process and how we go through this in session 6. But for now, what we want to really talk about is setting up future phases so that when we go to phase 1, we aren't building over phase 6, right? So we're taking the site and beginning to say, hey, what are the maximum usage that we can do with this building? It may be that we build a rectangle in the middle of the building, but it may be that we build a triangle in the corner and the rectangle gets built in phase 5. This is how we're thinking about it, is how can we begin in a broad scheming idea to understand the visions of the church, the ministry, and begin to set that up in the best way possible. Sustainable understanding of that. Flexible structures. So the second piece to this is that we build with structural steel. No load-bearing walls. We don't believe that the church is set enough in how they want to do things, right? We just started out this session talking about how church needs to be flexible and continuing to grow and change and move to be relevant to the culture, right? And so it's the same thing with structures. How you do kids ministry this year, I can just about guarantee, is not how it was done in the 1990s, in the 1980s, in the 1970s, right? And so we're seeing those changes. How you do church this year is not how you did it 10, 20 years ago, right? And so we've got to have the ability to begin to have flexible spaces. So we're building structural steel with no bearing walls through there, so they easily can be removed. If you were to call us on 95% of our churches and say, hey Dave, we want to remove a wall in this classroom, and we just wanted to call you to make sure that it's not a bearing wall. I could just tell you right then, and I would just pick up the phone and say, go Go ahead and remove it, you're good to go. Because we don't build with bearing walls, because it's just not effective for the future growth of your ministry. And flexible spaces. So this is what we're really talking about in reusing spaces. Again, how many hours a week are you using one specific space? And is there ways that we can continue to think how we can multi-use that space in a different way, reuse that space, reconfigure that space? You're going to come to me and say, yeah, but I've got to have somebody that comes in and sets up the chairs, takes down the tables, moves things around. I'm going to say, yes, you may have to. But it's going to be worth it in relation to thinking about the cost of building 2 of those versus 1 of those. And so, thinking about how we can be flexible in that type of space, sometimes it really makes a lot of sense to continue to develop that into a plan. Multi-use in gymnasium, and this is an actual gymatorium. This is something that we don't often suggest. This is the one multi-use type space that I would say, let's really think long and hard before we go to a gymatorium. Some of you probably are meeting in gymatoriums now, and you would come up and tell me, there's no way I'm doing that again, right? Some of you have met in those, some of you are meeting in those. But these do work in some situations, and it's just more of a situational based concept. There's a church that we are just going into phase 2 of building for them, and this is the church that they meet out of. It's a church out of California that does have a gymatorium. They've grown. They're getting close to 1,000 members there, and they're continuing to grow through that. They have a great athletic ministry that they work out of that, and so they're setting up chairs Sunday morning, taking them down for their ministry throughout the week. They've got a school in there as well, and so they're really utilizing that space in a really effective manner. Foyer and hub used for events. This church in specific, you can see kind of how they can divide up that space, divide up those walls. We'll talk more about the third space in a minute, the gathering area, foyer space, but we're seeing those get larger and larger. And so the question becomes, how can we multi-use these? How can we use these in a better manner to go ahead and shift those? Maybe throughout the week you don't need that large gathering space, so can we divide those up a little bit and begin to use that space in a different way? Multi-venue. This is kind of a newer trend we're seeing, is that a church may have, this church specifically has a younger congregation, millennial congregation that they're trying to reach, but the older congregation still likes that traditional feel, and so they actually went ahead and built 2 venues within that space. So you can see the one behind has those nice large environmental projection type screens going across. You've got a real contemporary feel with that. The same message is being preached every Sunday in both services. And as the people come out of those services, they are released at the same time, and they still have community. They still have a thriving community of the 2 meshing together after those services. And then stewardship focus. So relevant, flexible, and stewardship focused. Cost-effective buildings start with a stewardship-driven design philosophy. We're a ministry-based architect, so we understand churches first and foremost, and we understand that you are balancing the budgets, the money that God's given you first and foremost, right, and the hard-earned money that people within your ministry have given via tithes and offerings, sacrificial giving. And so it's important that we think about these things from the very beginning, and we want to be stewardship focused in understanding how we're using and utilizing those resources. We start with simplicity. This may automatically think in your mind that this is a bad word. This is not a bad word. We're seeing simplicity kind of begin to take over a lot of architecture. This is not just something we're seeing within churches, but you're seeing this within a lot of building types in general. As you drive down the road, some of those newer buildings, you're seeing a much more simplistic mindset to architecture. You're seeing simple building types with a highlighted centerpiece. And so that's what you're seeing even here is kind of a central located fixture that has really nice detail, really elegant design with kind of simplistic building type following from outside of this. This again is that Umatilla First Baptist Church. Again, this is kind of a traditional feel of a building to it, but in a simplistic representation, a simplistic translation to that idea is going ahead and taking that nice entry, nice large elegant entry space and turning that into it. And we've got to balance budget, function, and aesthetics. So this is a term that's standard in kind of the building and construction world, and we know that typically architects will tell you that you need to have budget, function, and aesthetics, but in actuality you can only have two of these, is what they'll say. You can have budget and function, and you'll sacrifice the aesthetics, right? You can have function and aesthetics. It's going to be an expensive building, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how that works. And what we've found is that in reality, as a church, you're going to say to me, yeah, but I need all three of those, right? I've got to have a cheap building, I've got to have the function still accommodating, and I've got to have a good-looking building. And so that's the trick, is really beginning to understand how we can balance all of those pieces together and counting the costs. We're going to talk more about this in the next couple sessions, but understanding what cost is available. Standard architecture will come to you and they'll say, hey, what's your budget? And you'll say, well, it's X amount of dollars. Okay, great. And then they'll throw that in the file and they say, all right, let's start dreaming, right? The problem is that then you'll end up at the end of that preliminary design with a great looking building that's never going to get built. You'll end up with a great set of plans, a roll of drawings that's going to sit in the corner of your office, and you're going to say, wow, that was a good looking building that's never going to get built. And architects are fine with that a lot of times because they're billing on a time basis, they're billing on a project basis, they've got their money, they're happy to do that, and they don't have any liability at all in that process. There's no liability of the building being built because it's just a pretty set of drawings that you're excited about, but it's going to sit in your office. And so what we want to do is count the costs from the very beginning. We want to know what that cost is, and then let's start to fit it in. Now, we may master plan, like we talked about, right? We may master plan a large full build out, but then let's begin to count the costs and tighten that down to something that's manageable so that you all can build that building and do the ministry that God's called you to do. And we've got to leverage free elements of architecture in that: color, natural light, scale, historical context. These are four elements that we know that we can begin to think about how we use, that are used in a free manner, right? Color, you're going to paint the building, so let's think about how we can do that. You're going to put some color into that building. Let's think about how we can do that in a way that matches you in with local culture, local things. Natural light, you want some windows bringing light in, so those are things that are free, right? Natural light is something that God has given us, right? From day one, right? Scale and mass, and then historical context. All these things are pieces that we can begin to use. What's your local area look like? What are the things that you can use? How can we begin to break the size of the building up with larger and smaller elements to begin to play with that architecture in that way? Repurposed buildings. This has some very good usage. These things, this is not a new concept. This is something that probably a lot of you are familiar with. You've probably talked with other pastor friends, other ministry leaders about this, about the opportunity to use local buildings and things like that. The one thing I will say to you on this is that the most important thing that you can do is hire a professional. Because I can't tell you how many churches have come to us after they've already bought the building, gone through the due diligence period, and they've said, hey, I've got this great building, can you come build it? And we say, well, that's great, but you're in a grocery store and that's not structurally sized for a large assembly space, and so now you've got to upgrade all these columns, you have to upgrade the structure. The next thing you know, that expense is actually more than if they would have just gone and bought a new piece of land, built a new building, and gone forward. So really think about that and count the cost. There are some great opportunities, and I'm going to show you a couple of them here. But first and foremost, make sure you count those costs before you jump into that process. This is a church that was an old science research facility. When I first walked into this building, there was a bunch of lab equipment. Every room had lab equipment. There was refrigerators and sinks and old lab equipment. The science research facility just got up, walked out, went to a new facility. I said, hey, well, can we reuse and resell this stuff? And the realtor said, nope, it's actually old, obsolete equipment, so it's all useless from that perspective. We might be able to salvage a couple of refrigerators or something like that, but that's about it. And so what they did is they went in and they bought this space, and they turned it into a new sanctuary space. That entry that you saw in the other picture is the far one on the right. They opened up a larger gathering space, took some classrooms out, and they even came in and raised the ceiling in one area. This, again, used to be, a science research facility broken down into rooms, and it turned into, a larger roof. They pushed the roof up about 6 feet and went in and did that, and still came in significantly cheaper than if they would have built a new building, bought a new site. They were still able to do all those things. So one great example, right? Just looking for that space and being able to upgrade. This is a grocery store on the East Coast that, again, we did. And they actually are part of a larger development. The church bought the whole development. So they're getting some retail lease payments from other buildings within that area. There's several other businesses that are in this area. And it's an old supermarket that went out of business. This church is actually opening in the next couple of weeks, and so this is actually an old picture. They've continued to kind of develop that space into, some things similar to what you're seeing in this area with some play structure, some check-in space, a large gathering area, and then moving into a sanctuary space. There's a lot of times columns, that are going to be within some of these spaces. Fortunately, we've come up with this new technology called invisible paint. Okay, I'm just kidding. Just seeing if you all are still awake this morning. No, but there are different tricks that we've begun to think about how we can do that. Painting those columns black and they start to kind of disappear. Things that we can do from an early beginning and understanding, hey, maybe we take out one of these columns and we begin to structurally pin these things to other columns and reinforcing those spaces. And so there's a lot of things that we'll do within these spaces. So just because a space has a column every 20 feet in both directions doesn't necessarily mean that it's an inviable space. It's something, again, to bring in a professional, bring in an architect, bring in a structural engineer, and let's begin to think about how we can, if that space is a viable opportunity for you as a church. This is an office building. The church actually has a really cool story behind this. We just did a seminar at this building a few weeks ago, and just a great story of how God directed them from one building to the next, and they ended up at this 3 buildings down the road, and in several years they had 2 or 3 buildings. They ended up being able to sell off the other 2 buildings, buy this building, and they're now meeting in an area they call I think it's called The Shed, and it's a small, low-ceiling structure. They have about 150 to 200 people meeting in this area, and they've just come back to us now to come back and design their larger sanctuary. They're going to take out a floor within this area, build a larger space. Again, this is in Brea, California. There is no open land in Brea, California. There's no space to build, and so they found this and were able to grow into it in a space that really is kind of a really unique area. Again, this was an office building, so it's got great classrooms, opening up a few of those offices into classrooms in that space. This is that shed, they call it. It's kind of a lower ceiling, kind of contemporary feel. Again, that kind of warm industrial. You've got the open ceiling within that as well. Manufacturing facilities. Eric's going to talk more about the Coke bottling facility that's in Ogden, Utah, our events center that's kind of began to house the Genesis Project as a really cool case study for what you can do with an event center type space. This is the look of that on the outside. I'm just going to kind of flip through this quick because Eric will hit that a little bit more in the next stage. Auto dealerships. Auto dealerships are a great concept. As you look at this building, you can see automatically a great church could come out of that. And in fact, in this case, it did. This is the exact building. They've got these large showroom floors, right, that are just large clear spans that we can easily turn into a church type space. And then let's just hit for the last couple minutes some spatial design concepts. 4 areas that I really want to talk about that we're seeing kind of different trending spaces: the worship space, the third space, the children's and youth space, and then some financial sustainability to kind of end things up. Worship spaces. So what we're seeing is a change from a sacred space to a sacred experience. And this is taking different forms. I was just at a Anglican church last week, and they wanted to create a different space within the area that they were in. and they still wanted that sacred space. And so they actually put just a little 10 by 10 room that kind of became their chapel. They've got an altar in there and some different things like that they're going ahead and changing. They still have kind of that sacred space, but the larger space becomes an area that they can transform. Right? They can change that from on a Sunday morning where it has an experiential feel. There's the Sunday morning church aspect. And then throughout the week, maybe they set up tables and chairs. And so, again, beginning to use kind of that multi-use concept. And we're seeing this change from older generations to the newer millennial generation. The millennial generation is saying, hey, we can have an experience at any point. We can meet with God at any point. It doesn't have to be in a building or in a specific location, but let's begin to set up the experience within that space instead of coming to a sacred space. Performing arts, worship design. So here's what we're seeing is that older churches, the traditional churches that we're talking about, had kind of a long linear feel. If you were to go to any of the churches in Europe, some of those older Catholic churches, or even the older congregational Christian churches, those kind of evangelical churches, they have a traditional long feel, right? They have just a short, width, but then a long feel. And so what happens with that is you lose a lot of sight lines, you lose a lot of visibility, you lose a lot of AVL capabilities, sound capabilities within that space. And so what we're finding is that within the performing arts realm, there's some really good concepts with that. There's a concept that says if you are further than 65 to 70 feet away from whoever's speaking on stage or the person that you're trying to view on stage, then you can no longer see visual cues. And if you were to go to those Catholic churches or those older traditional churches in America, even some of those churches, there's a significant amount of seats that are further than 65 feet away, right? It gets pretty far and pretty long, and those are the areas that you and I might go to if we had a long night the night before, and we'd sit and we'd sleep and say that we went to church. What we're doing instead is saying, hey, you know what? Within a space like these buildings, this building right here, you can begin to say there's 900 seats within this area. That's what this space is. This is a floor plan that we're just finishing building, actually, in North Carolina, Believers Church. And they have 900 seats within this space. If you were to do this in a traditional space, you would end up looking at cutting it off somewhere in this area. If everybody can see that, I don't know. And you would end up with seating for about 200. And that's within a depth of 65 to 70 feet in this space. So instead, what we're saying is let's go ahead and fan that out on a performing arts center. Performing arts does it for financial reasons, right? More people in seats with better access to the stage means better dollars and more dollars. We're doing it from a standpoint of saying, hey, let's create a community. Let's begin to design a space that people can feel like they've connected with the pastor on a Sunday morning. That the worship leader who's up front can actually connect with people and encourage them in worship as they're singing on the stage. Let's begin to get this feel even of if someone's on one side of the sanctuary, they can see everyone else worshiping, and there's a community aspect of community worship within that space. And so thinking about it from that perspective, and then additionally, getting more people closer to the stage, right? That's really the key to this performing arts. And so that's one thing that we're seeing a lot more of a transition towards. In fact, in several cases, we've now begun to take traditional churches that are the long churches with the stage at the end, and we've started putting the stage on the side. And some of you may have seen some of these. This is not necessarily a proprietary idea to BGW, but you've started to see some of these things where they're creating that traditional space. We've done that in a couple of cases now. This is a picture of just kind of that, performing arts. I don't know if it's coming out very clear to all of you out there, but this is a little better picture here. Again, that kind of idea of fanning that out. This is Northlands Church, just close. Some of you may be familiar, have been in with that church. Again, 58% of churches that have completed a construction project in the past 3 years have included AVL upgrades in their projects. This is just kind of a quick blurb to say, hey, there's going to be some money that's probably spent on AVL, audio, visual, and lighting, and those are key pieces. And what we have found over the years is that has the single highest potential to blow your budget in 2 seconds. The second that the AVL consultant walks in the door, and the second they sit down at the table, right? There is some very expensive AVL that can happen within a church, and so you've got to be really careful. We have begun working with a company called BGW Tech. They've kind of taken on the name and become part of the family. We are huge proponents of them simply because they understand the church ministry process. They understand what a church needs and doesn't need. They understand the things that are key within that. And so we suggest that you at least kind of interview them and give them a run. They have come in several cases where a church has been over budget with AVL consultants, and they've brought that back under in a timely manner and in a cost-effective manner. And so that's just kind of a quick shot for them. Environmental projection is something we're seeing a lot more of. So again, this is one of those kind of steps, right? 15, 20 years ago, there were we were worried about whether we put a projector in the room, right? How many of you have had that argument within the church 10, 20 years ago? Now we're talking about how many projectors can we put in, and can we put that across the whole stage and begin to really change that space. There's a couple things you can do with this. One, we've seen churches that say, hey, we're going to no longer have a youth room. We're going to change this to be our youth room. We've got a little storage space. We open up the doors. We bring out maybe some ping pong tables, some pool tables or whatever, some seating areas for them within that space. We change that space around from that way. And then we change the environmental projection to be more of a youth-minded focus, right, within that. The other thing that we're seeing is that, a pastor can change to begin to feel the ambiance. You're talking about the cedars of Lebanon, and you've got trees all behind you, right? You're talking about David and Goliath, and you've got the brook with 5 stones on the one side and Goliath standing on the other. You're starting to see, hey, Goliath was actually this tall, and you're standing beside him on this side and walking. So you're able to really just kind of really get creative with what you can do with that space and begin to be really visually minded within those things. LED walls is additionally, it's kind of that next step from projection. So there used to be projectors. Now we're doing LED walls. The nice thing about this is that, I think you're going to start seeing in the next few years a transition back towards getting some of that natural light within the church. We're still within a context where a lot of you are saying, I don't want any windows. If there's any sound guys or lighting guys in the church or any worship arts people in this room today, you'll tell me I don't want any lights. But I got to tell you that there is a connection that's happening within the third space. We just talked about that, how we were trying to get natural light, and I think you're going to start seeing that again within the church buildings, is beginning to transition and try and get more natural light. LED walls do a great job of not get washed out and having issues with that. You're able to still keep a lot of that lighting and brilliance within that. This is a church that is getting creative with cost-effective backdrops. This is a church that BGW Tech did, and can anybody guess what these little pixels are? Anybody guess? They're plastic plates. They're actually plastic plates that you could get for 50 cents and then they've backlit those with lighting. And so just really kind of intricate, interesting ways that you can begin to do that in a cost-effective manner. There's a lot of churches that are doing these things. I never was a huge fan of Pinterest, but I got to tell you, there's a lot of things that you can find on Pinterest when it comes to backstage design, right? Connectivity and wireless technology, what we're seeing with this is that, there's just, again, kind of that next step, that it used to be whether or not, we should have cell phones in the church. People should be on their cell phones. Now we're saying, hey, we need to provide wireless so that people can connect, so that they can check your scripture references as you're talking, and those kind of things. May not be quite as good for all you pastors out there, but I got to tell you, it's a necessity within the church is that you provide wireless so that people can connect, both through social media to each other. There's a lot of unique ways that pastors are starting to do those things and connecting within the church, even on a Sunday morning, doing surveys and different ideas like that. And then additionally, just creating displays, using technology in a subtle and unique way. So we're not just putting a TV screen on the wall in the foyer, but we're integrating that within the space. We're taking some projectors and projecting some ideas down onto that wall in a subtle and unique way that begins to kind of change that space on a Sunday to Sunday basis. Again, just kind of talking about that BGW technology. A little bit, we mentioned some of these pieces that are kind of key pieces: lighting technology, sound technology. There's any number. I could have Jim Martin come in here and talk to you guys for 4 hours about the technology changes and things that are going on. Third place. So just real quick, the secular concept of third place is what we're bringing into this. It's not your home. It's not your work. It's that third place that you go, right? In the secular context, it's the bar. It's the place that you go to have community. For you and me, it's, how many of us are going to leave from this seminar today and stop at a Starbucks or a Panera and sit down and have a cup of coffee? You may even be, meeting with your own group after this and going to one of those places and having that community within that space. And so what we're really trying to do is within a gathering area, begin to set up that same concept. So as someone comes in, they can feel uniquely connected, that, hey, I know this space. This is the same space that I went to yesterday and talked with a friend about an issue that I was having in my marriage. These different kind of spaces, again, just become that larger gathering space. Additionally, that space needs to be the first space that you come into. It's the space that you come into, you get a cup of coffee, you can immediately tell, hey, this is where I take my kids, this is where I go to church, this is where I use the bathroom, where I get coffee. All these kind of pieces are all centered around a center hub spot, right? And so that's really what we're trying to do. The old traditional church, you would walk into a narthex, you would wipe your feet off, take your coat off, walk into a church. If you wanted to drop your kids off, you would go down a hallway off of the side of the church, down a set of stairs, under a corridor, around, take a right, 2 left. Some of you are laughing because that's how your church is, right? And so what we really want to do is make people feel at home. A guest should be able to come in to your home, to your church, and automatically tell without you having 10 volunteers directing at each corner, hey, go down that way, yeah, go down this way, go down this way. You should be able to tell automatically. And so that's what we're doing in a lot of cases, is developing these older churches in a way that really makes sense and really setting up this third place, this gathering area. These gathering areas 5-10 years ago, I would have told you that you needed to have half the size of your sanctuary. Then 4 or 5 years ago, I said, well, you probably need to bump that into 2/3 the size of the sanctuary. Now we're telling churches that community space needs to be the same size as the sanctuary. And what we're just finding is that more and more people are desiring that community. The sequential layout has made it challenging. You're seeing that community center just really need to be starting to be bigger and bigger. And we're saying that millennials are kind of pushing this, that they're the driving force behind this, that millennials are huge proponents of gathering spaces, these large areas. But in reality, I would submit to you that every single one of us wants community. From the 99-year-old to the 2-year-old, we're looking for that community. And so if we can create that space, that it's no longer about just coming, sitting at a chair on Sunday morning, hearing a sermon that may or may not change your life, and then walking out. It's time to begin to create a space where we can begin to have that accountability, where we can have that authentic community and communication with each other. And this is really what that space does. And so while 78% of millennials choose the word community to describe their ideal church, I would submit to you that all of us, 100% of all generations, desire in some form community, right? That's why God really in reality created us. That's why he created man and women. So here's kind of just a couple of pictures of those spaces, some of these areas that you're seeing, just again, beginning to bring some of that natural texture we talked about earlier, some of those that natural light, the stone and the rock, the natural wood tones, pieces like that. Cafes are within this space. Again, this is another one of those that some of you probably had arguments 10 to 20 years ago about whether we could bring a cup of coffee in the sanctuary. And so you said, well, maybe we'll put a coffee pot in the foyer space or down in the family life center, and we'll put a pot of coffee. Then you said, well, you know what? We can put a couple of carafes, 2 or 3 of them, and we'll throw a couple of coffee cups. You don't have to bring your own. Now we're saying, hey, we can put a whole coffee cafe in there, right? Some of you are really starting to get into that. And it's a community atmosphere. Again, you're bringing that community further into that space and saying we're building a Starbucks within this space. We're building that idea of a relaxed community gathering type area. This is Hub 801 Coffee. Again, that event center that we talked about in Ogden, they actually built a coffee shop, and they're serving 7 days a week, Sunday morning. Coffee, as well as throughout the week. They're a business operating as a coffee shop. It's not always the greatest of concepts. These guys already had kind of something established. Ultimately, we find it being the coffee shop being more of a ministry than an actually money-making scenario, depending on the case. Those gathering spaces become intimate gathering areas. And then children's and youth space, the third thing here. Research shows that churches grow when they reach out to kids. This is something I will say that millennials kind of have driven a little bit more. We're finding that millennials, when they come in to drop their kids off, expect the children's spaces to be better than their spaces that they've developed at home. And I don't know how many of you have kids or grandkids and know what those spaces look like. But I would submit to you that most of our churches don't compare to the nurseries that are set up within the houses of the kids nowadays. And we've really got to start thinking about how we can develop those spaces in a unique way, in a custom way. There's a lot of really cool ideas that we've begun to think about in that. And I would just submit to you that this is the key to the whole thing. You know, here's what's going to happen on a Sunday morning when you have an experiential radical change space. The parents are going to bring the kids, they're going to drop them off. The kids are going to have a great experience, right, in a great space. The ministry has been focused on a specific area. They're going to pick up their kids and they're going to walk out, and 7 days later the kids are going to say, hey, well, are we going back to that? And it may not be even 7 days. It may be the next morning. Can we go back tomorrow morning? Can we go back the next morning? I want to go back again. The kids are going to draw the parents to your church, and that's really what's going to happen, is that you're going to grow because of the kids space that you develop. And so we're seeing development of that spaces. There's a lot of different concepts with interior design of these spaces, creating spaces. This is Grace Fellowship in Orlando, right? Orlando. And this just finished. If you want to get a tour of this, see Brian, he'll get you through this. They've built actually a large play area. These play structures are great for Sunday mornings. They're great as a lighthouse draw. We typically say, hey, put that in the front of your building, put some nice glass on that, turn those lights on 24/7. Every kid that drives by in the neighborhood is going to know that there's a play area right there. And I got to tell you, it's a great ministry opportunity. We've seen churches that say, hey, bring your kids, moms, bring your kids on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings, have a cup of coffee, come to our moms group or come to our Bible study, drop your kids off, let them play. And I got to tell you, if my wife knew that was happening within driving distance, she'd be there without fail every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the full amount of time, right? And so this is what we're seeing, is that we're putting some of these spaces in here. They're done not just as a ministry tool, but an outreach tool. We've seen churches that also have said, hey, we're going to have a babysitting night. Bring your kids. Babysitting, the ticket to get you your free babysitting is to bring another couple who doesn't go to our church, another unsaved couple or whatever, and you guys go on a date with them, do the couple-to-couple date, drop your kids off, and go hang out and have community together with someone, use it as a ministry opportunity. And so there's just so many easy ways to begin to think about things, and then finally it serves as that lighthouse. It really does. I mean, everybody knows that, hey, we care about kids. We've put them first and foremost. We've got this great big facility that we're beginning to show within that. This is why we're saying that the kids' spaces need to be visible from the outside, not just for natural light, but so that people can see what's going on within that space so they can see, hey, this space is awesome for kids and they care about kids. This church loves what's going on there, seeing some of these things within that. This is a church, again, in California that built a dedicated ministry building. Now they have an old traditional church, right? And they said, no, it's more important that we build the children's ministry first. And they're already growing. They just opened this and they're growing already. I would guess that they'll be back in to build another phase onto their sanctuary and change that sanctuary around in just a few short years. And it's because of their starting with their dedication to the children's ministry. Again, indoor playgrounds we talked about, themed environments. There's a lot of concepts we're beginning to look at with that. Clean colors, large spaces for kids to have move around and engage in the worship space. Balancing that wow factor with children's spaces. So there's two things with that, right? You've got to have the function, and then the other key to this that I'm sure a lot of you are significantly aware of is the security within that space. We've really got to start thinking about how we'd handle that in a much better way and keeping that a secure space. Use space, I'm going to flip through these things really quick. Best spaces employ an open concept, and then technology is key. This is another building. Brian, which one was this again? Remind me again. Journey Christian Church, yeah, in Apopka, right? Apopka, Florida. And they designed a white box space. So you've heard of black boxes. This is a white box. Has technology on all walls. Basically what you're doing here is you're saying, hey, we've got screens, white screens on all four walls that we can really do technology. We can change the space around. There was a seminar last year in Apopka, right? Yeah, and everybody kind of came in and saw a white room, a white space, kind of stark and blank as they were walking in and thinking, oh, BGW built this building. What kind of architects are these guys? They don't do a very good job of designing. Suddenly the technology came on, right? And then at the end of the seminar, everybody said, hey, I want one of those. Give me two of those, right? I want a couple of those spaces in my area. Cafes are not just for the adults. Cafes are for the younger youth as well. What we're finding is that the youth are not as interested in gymnasiums and large play areas, sports type spaces. Instead, they're saying, hey, we want that community space. We want to hang out with friends and kind of talk about things around a cup of coffee as well. And so we're designing those into there. There are still some recreational themes within that.